There are temptations so beautiful, they do not feel like danger at all, only like truth whispered softly at the exact moment you are weakest. On certain nights, when the sea lay flat as polished obsidian, ancient sailors believed the world itself leaned closer to listen. The oars slowed, the wind seemed to hold its breath, and then, from nowhere and everywhere at once, came a song, not loud, not urgent, gentle, intimate, a voice that did not command but understood. The sirens did not promise gold or glory, they promised recognition. They sang of who you could be, of the life you deserved, of rest after long striving. Men did not leap into the sea because they were foolish. They leapt because, for a brief moment, the song felt more real than survival. This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about you, about me, about every human who has ever sworn discipline in the morning and broken it by nightfall. The ancients knew something modern people forget. That temptation does not announce itself as destruction. It arrives dressed as relief, as reward, as a small, reasonable exception. And yet, among all the sailors who vanished beneath those waters, one man chose a different fate. He did not trust his strength. He did not believe in his future self. Instead, he designed a trap for his own weakness and called it wisdom. This essay is about that choice, about why freedom, unguarded, becomes a liability, about how wealth is rarely built by heroic resistance, but by quiet decisions made long before desire arrives. If you have ever wondered why knowledge alone never seems to save you, why discipline feels exhausting, why money slips through intelligent hands, then you are exactly where you need to be. If this journey speaks to you, consider liking this video, subscribing to the Echoes of Wealth channel, or supporting this work through a donation. These small gestures help keep the fire burning and the stories alive. The most dangerous voice in your life will never shout, never threaten, never rush you because it already knows you are listening. There is a moment that comes to almost everyone, usually late at night or early in the morning, when the world feels quiet enough to confess. In that moment, a voice begins to speak inside you. It does not sound like temptation. It sounds like permission. It says you have worked hard enough. It says one exception will not matter. It says tomorrow will be different. And because it speaks in your own tone, with your own memories, it feels trustworthy. Ancient sailors would have recognized this voice instantly. They gave it a body and a name. They called it the Sirens. The Sirens did not chase ships. They waited. They knew that men would steer themselves closer. Their song was not crude desire. It was memory and promise braided together. They sang of home, of victories that would be remembered, of wounds that would finally be understood. To hear them was to feel seen. That is why men jumped, not because they were reckless, but because the song made the sea feel like a return rather than an ending. Modern life is filled with the same melody. It hums through advertisements, notifications, celebrations, and even advice that sounds wise. Spend now, you deserve it. Delay later, you can always recover. One more scroll, one more purchase, one more indulgence. The voice never asks for everything. It asks only for this moment, and moment by moment, it leads intelligent people into quiet ruin. What makes this terrifying is not ignorance. Most people already know what they should do. Save more, consume less, think long term. The failure does not come from lack of information. It comes from timing. Desire always arrives before reflection. By the time reason speaks, the hand has already reached for the edge of the ship. The ancients understood something that feels uncomfortable to admit. That self-control is unreliable under pressure. That the future version of you is not stronger, only further away. And that wisdom does not mean trusting yourself more. It means trusting yourself less and designing your life accordingly. This is why one man survived the Sirens, not by resisting them, but by surrendering his freedom before the song ever reached his ears. His name was Odysseus, and his solution feels radical even now. He did not ask to be warned. He did not ask to be reminded of his goals. He asked to be bound. Tonight, by this imagined fire, we are going to walk slowly into that decision. We are going to follow the rope around the mast, feel its roughness against the skin, and understand why this ancient act is not about myth at all. It is about architecture, about building a life that does not depend on heroism, about wealth that grows quietly because temptation no longer has a vote. By the end of this journey, the Sirens will still be singing. They never stop. But their power will feel different, smaller, distant, like a song heard from a shore you no longer need to reach. The sea did not look dangerous that day. That is the detail worth remembering first. No black clouds, no screaming wind, no sign that death was near. The water was smooth, almost welcoming, like a mirror laid out for the ship to admire itself. This is how temptation prefers to arrive. Calm, reasonable, unannounced. Odysseus stood near the mast, long before the song appeared, listening to the ordinary sounds of travel, the soft rhythm of oars cutting water, the faint groan of wood stretching against rope, the breath of men who believed the hardest trials were already behind them. They had survived monsters and storms. They believed survival was a matter of courage. Odysseus knew better. Courage had carried him far, but it had never protected him from himself. He had heard the stories long before he ever saw this stretch of sea. Sailors who vanished without a trace. Ships found drifting, intact, crew gone, as if the ocean itself had gently erased them. The Sirens were blamed, but Odysseus suspected something deeper. Monsters killed by force, the Sirens killed by invitation. That distinction mattered. He knew that when the song came, it would not sound like madness. It would sound like insight. It would not demand obedience. It would offer understanding, and because of that, he did something no hero before him had done. He prepared not for battle, but for persuasion. Before the island ever appeared on the horizon, he gathered his crew. He did not dramatize the moment. He did not speak of glory. His voice was steady, almost restrained, as if he were giving instructions for tying a sail. He told them to take beeswax and press it deep into their ears, not as a gesture, but as a seal. He watched carefully as each man obeyed, ensuring no sound could slip through. Then he gave the order that unsettled them. They were to bind him to the mast, not loosely, not symbolically. He demanded knots that would hold even if he fought them. He told them where to place the rope, how tight to pull, how many turns to make. He did not soften the command with reassurance. He knew that hesitation would weaken it, and then he added the most important instruction of all. When the song came, when he screamed or reasoned or threatened, they were not to listen. If he ordered them to untie him, they were to tighten the ropes instead. This was not an act of trust in his men, it was an act of distrust in himself. Odysseus understood something most people never articulate. That future you is not a wiser you, it is a compromised you. Desire changes the rules of judgment. What feels obvious in calm waters becomes negotiable under pressure. He was not trying to prove his strength. He was removing the need for it entirely. When the ship entered the Sirens' waters, nothing changed at first. The sea remained still, the air remained warm, and then, slowly, the song arrived. It did not crash over the ship, it drifted, it slid between thoughts. It sounded personal, as if it had been waiting for him specifically. They sang of his intelligence, of his long suffering, of how deeply misunderstood he was. They sang of rest, of recognition, of a life where his struggles would finally make sense. They sang as if they knew his private doubts, the ones he never shared with his crew. The rope dug into his skin as he leaned forward, straining toward the sound. He did not feel controlled, he felt awakened. This is the lie temptation tells best, that it is revealing truth rather than distorting it. Odysseus began to speak. His words were not wild, they were precise. He argued, he commanded, he promised rewards. He accused his men of cruelty for ignoring him. Any one of those arguments would have worked under normal circumstances. He was their king, their strategist, their survivor, but the men did not look at him. They stared forward and rowed harder, the wax sealing them inside a world without song. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because Odysseus did not sound insane. He sounded reasonable. Had the ropes not been there, had he trusted himself just a little more, he would have stepped willingly into the sea. The ropes held. As the ship moved beyond the island, the song faded. Not abruptly, but reluctantly, like a voice losing interest. Odysseus sagged against the mast, his body exhausted, his pride wounded, his life intact. He did not celebrate. He did not speak. He understood what had happened. He had survived not because he was strong, but because he had designed his weakness into the system. This is where the story quietly becomes about money. Most financial failures do not come from ignorance. They come from moments when money is close enough to touch and choice feels immediate, when income arrives, when desire flares, when the future feels abstract and the present feels convincing. People believe they will decide well when the time comes. Odysseus did not leave that decision for later. He decided when he was calm, rational, and unprovoked. Automated savings work for the same reason the rope worked. Money removed before you see it cannot sing to you. It cannot flatter you. It cannot argue that you deserve more. It bypasses the part of you that negotiates and moves directly into the part of you that plans. This is not about discipline. It is about timing. The Sirens did not disappear after Odysseus passed. They kept singing. Other ships kept arriving. The difference was never the song. It was whether the sailor believed he could listen safely. When the ropes were finally loosened, Odysseus did not thank his men. Gratitude would have been dishonest. What he felt was closer to shame, not the kind that diminishes a man, but the kind that clarifies him. He had heard the song, he had wanted it, and the wanting had frightened him more than any monster he had faced on this long return home. The Greeks admired strength, but Odysseus understood fragility. He had learned it early, long before the Sirens, long before the war. As a boy in Ithaca, he was known less for brute force than for observation. He watched how men spoke differently when they wanted something, how promises softened voices, how pride disguised fear. Even then, he noticed something unsettling. The same man could speak wisdom at dawn and foolishness at dusk without noticing the contradiction. Odysseus grew up knowing that identity was unstable under desire. That knowledge followed him into adulthood. During the Trojan War, it was not Achilles' rage that interested him, but its predictability. Achilles was powerful, but Odysseus saw the weakness beneath it. Anger could be provoked, honor could be manipulated, even heroes had levers. Odysseus himself was no exception. He loved recognition. He loved being the clever one, the indispensable mind. The Sirens sang directly into that wound. Some later storytellers added rumors to his tale. They whispered that Odysseus lingered near the island longer than necessary. That part of him wanted to test the ropes, to see how far he could lean before they failed. Whether true or not, the rumor survives because it feels believable. We all flirt with the edge once we believe we are protected. This is where most modern systems fail. People build safeguards, but they make them optional. A savings plan that can be paused, a rule that can be bent, a boundary that exists only when it is convenient. Odysseus did not give himself that luxury. His genius was not foresight alone, but finality. Once the knots were tied, debate was over. The psychology of this is uncomfortable because it implies something we resist admitting, that in moments of temptation, we are not sovereign. We are influenced, altered, temporarily unrecognizable to our calmer selves. Ancient philosophers hinted at this when they spoke of the divided soul, one part rational, one impulsive, one hungry for praise. Odysseus did not try to harmonize them. He chose which voice would have authority and when. This is the heart of pre-commitment. You do not argue with future temptation. You outvote it in advance. In financial life, the Sirens appear most often at moments of surplus. A raise, a bonus, a sudden inflow. Money arrives carrying possibility, and possibility invites fantasy. You imagine the life it could buy, the version of yourself it could validate. At that moment, logic becomes negotiable. You tell yourself you will save later, invest later, be disciplined later. Later is always quieter than now. Automated systems exist to solve this exact problem, but people misunderstand their purpose. They treat automation as convenience. It is not. It is a moral intervention. It removes the need for character in moments when character is least reliable. Just as Odysseus removed his crew's ability to hear him, automation removes your ability to interfere with yourself. There is a reason the most enduring institutions use force structures. Ancient temples required offerings before entry. Guilds demanded dues before benefits. Even monasteries imposed vows that eliminated choice. These were not acts of oppression. They were acknowledgments of human nature. Left alone with desire, humans negotiate themselves into ruin. Odysseus's men understood this instinctively, even if they could not articulate it. They trusted the earlier version of their king more than the screaming one bound to the mast. That trust is rare. Most people trust their present feelings more than their past decisions, even when the past was calmer, wiser, and better informed. The Sirens' island faded behind them, but the lesson did not. Odysseus carried it forward, though not always successfully. There are other stories where he fails to bind himself, where curiosity or pride takes control. The myth does not present him as perfect. It presents him as aware. Awareness is enough to survive if it is paired with structure. This is why wealth built slowly tends to endure. It is surrounded by rituals, delays, and restrictions that prevent impulse from gaining access. The tragedy of modern finance is not complexity, it is immediacy. One tap, one swipe, one moment of weakness, amplified by systems designed to sing. The sirens still exist. They live in polished images, in language that flatters effort and excuses indulgence. They do not want your destruction, they want your attention, and attention, once surrendered, pulls the body with it. Odysseus did not silence the song, he simply made sure it arrived too late to matter. After the Sirens' island disappeared beyond the horizon, something subtle changed among the crew. The journey continued, but the air aboard the ship felt heavier, quieter, not because of fear, but because a certain illusion had been broken. They had seen their king reduced to pleading, to desperation, to something painfully human, and Odysseus knew they had seen it. In later years, poets would glorify this episode as cleverness, as another proof of his unmatched intelligence. But intelligence was not the core of what happened. What mattered was humility. Odysseus accepted a truth most leaders avoid, that in the presence of desire, authority dissolves. Titles mean nothing. Past victories mean nothing. Only structure remains. There is an old and lesser-known variation of the myth, whispered in fragments rather than sung aloud. In it, Odysseus does not smile when he is untied. He avoids the eyes of his men. He is disturbed not by how close he came to death, but by how convincing his own arguments sounded while he was bound. He realizes that if he had encountered the Sirens even once before this moment, without preparation, his story would have ended there. The realization is chilling. Survival was not the result of growth, it was the result of timing. This is the part of the myth that cuts closest to modern life. Most people assume maturity will save them, that with enough experience, enough intelligence, enough self-knowledge, they will finally become immune to temptation. Odysseus's experience suggests the opposite. The more complex the mind, the more elaborate the justifications it can produce. Desire does not weaken with intelligence. It becomes articulate. Consider how often people betray their own long-term goals with arguments that sound reasonable in the moment. This purchase will improve my productivity. This indulgence will restore my energy. This risk is necessary for growth. These are not foolish thoughts. They are half-truths deployed at the wrong time. The Sirens did not lie outright. They selected truths that served destruction. Odysseus survived because he separated planning from execution. The decision to listen was made in one state of mind. The consequences were felt in another. And between those two states, he placed something unbreakable. Rope does not negotiate. Systems do not empathize. They hold. In financial terms, this is the difference between intention and mechanism. Intention lives in the future. Mechanism operates in the present. Most people live entirely inside intention. They plan to save. They plan to invest. They plan to stop overspending. But when money arrives, there is no rope, only choice. And choice, under emotional pressure, is fragile. There is a reason many ancient cultures distrusted abundance without ritual. In Sparta, wealth was deliberately made inconvenient. Heavy iron currency, difficult to transport, impossible to hoard discreetly. The goal was not equality, it was restraint. Convenience invites indulgence. Friction invites reflection. Odysseus created friction where it mattered most. He made movement impossible at the moment of maximum temptation. Modern systems rarely do this by default. Instead, they optimize for ease, speed, and pleasure. Money flows quickly. Credit fills gaps instantly. Desire is met without delay. In such a world, relying on self-control is not noble, it is naive. There is another detail often overlooked. Odysseus did not ask to be put to sleep. He wanted to hear the song. He wanted knowledge without consequence. This is important. Pre-commitment is not avoidance. It is controlled exposure. You do not need to eliminate desire to master it. You need to experience it safely. In financial life, this translates to awareness without participation. You can observe markets without trading impulsively. You can enjoy beauty without buying it. You can hear the song without steering toward the rocks. This requires distance. Automation creates that distance. Time creates that distance. Illiquidity creates that distance. The people who mistake discipline for denial often burn out. Odysseus did not deny himself the song. He denied its control. That distinction matters. Wealth built on constant suppression collapses under exhaustion. Wealth built on structure endures quietly, without drama. When the ship sailed on, the Sirens were still singing, but their song had no jurisdiction. That is the goal, not silence, irrelevance. Odysseus returned home many trials later, scarred and altered. The ropes were long gone, but the lesson remained. He had learned where his sovereignty ended and where systems must begin. Most people never learn this. They keep listening, convinced that next time they will be strong enough, and next time, like all temptations, sounds even sweeter. As the days passed after the Sirens, Odysseus noticed something else within himself, something quieter than fear, but heavier than relief. The memory of the song did not fade. It lingered, not as sound, but as a feeling, a residue. At unexpected moments, while staring at the horizon or listening to the low murmur of his crew at night, he would recall how right the song had felt, not how beautiful, how right. This troubled him more than the struggle at the mast, because if temptation had announced itself as false, resistance would have been easy. The truth Odysseus confronted was brutal. The Sirens had not invented his desires. They had revealed them. They had articulated impulses he already carried, doubts he had buried under duty and momentum. The ropes did not protect him from lies. They protected him from truths arriving at the wrong time, in the wrong order, with the wrong authority. Ancient thinkers understood this tension deeply. Plato wrote of the soul as a chariot pulled by opposing horses, one disciplined, one wild. Most people spend their lives yanking the reins, exhausted, proud of each small correction. Odysseus chose another approach. He stopped the chariot before the descent and locked the wheels. He did not argue with the horses. He removed their leverage. This distinction matters, especially in financial life, because money is not neutral. It amplifies whatever state of mind receives it. In calm hands, it becomes a tool. In restless hands, it becomes fuel. Many people blame spending habits on personality, upbringing, even fate. Odysseus' story suggests something simpler and more unsettling. Behavior follows access. When access is immediate, impulse rules. When access is delayed, reason has time to arrive. Think about the moment income appears, a notification, a number changing on a screen. That instant is the modern equivalent of the siren's first note. Subtle, private, intimate, no one else sees it. No one else hears it, and immediately, a conversation begins inside you. You deserve something. You can afford it. You have been disciplined long enough. These thoughts do not feel reckless. They feel earned. Odysseus did not trust himself in that moment. He understood that the presence of desire changes the hierarchy of values. Long-term goals grow quiet. Immediate sensations grow loud. This is not a moral failure. It is neurological reality. The brain prioritizes what is present over what is abstract. The future has no voice unless you give it one. Pre-commitment is how the future speaks in advance. By binding himself, Odysseus allowed his earlier, clearer self to overrule his later, compromised one. In financial terms, this is why automated systems work even for people who consider themselves undisciplined. The system does not care how you feel. It does not negotiate. It does not get tired. It executes the decision you made when you were not being sung to. There is a quiet cruelty in how modern culture frames self-control. It celebrates the individual who resists endlessly, who says no again and again, who battles desire daily. But constant resistance is a tax. It drains attention, energy, and identity. Over time, even the strongest will begin to look for rest. That is when exceptions are born. Odysseus built rest into the system. Once tied, he could struggle without consequence. His men could row without debate. The decision had already been made. This is the overlooked mercy of structure. It reduces the number of decisions required to remain aligned. Notice how many people sabotage themselves, not through extravagance, but through frequency. Small indulgences, repeated often, justified each time. The Sirens did not ask Odysseus to leap immediately. They drew him closer, slowly, until the final step felt inevitable. Modern consumption works the same way. It rarely ruins you in one dramatic act. It erodes you through 1,000 reasonable ones. Structure interrupts this erosion. There is a reason certain forms of wealth are intentionally illiquid. Retirement accounts penalize early withdrawal. Long-term investments resist impulsive access. Even ancient treasure was buried, locked, hidden, not because people feared thieves alone, but because they feared themselves. Easy access is an invitation. Difficulty is a guardian. Odysseus' ropes were not comfortable. They cut, they bruised. Discipline is often portrayed as gentle alignment. In reality, it can hurt in the short term. Saying no to yourself feels like loss when the song is playing, but that pain is finite. The pain of regret is not. As the voyage continued, Odysseus began to see his journey differently. Each challenge was no longer a test of strength, but a test of foresight. Where could he bind himself earlier? Where could he remove choice before temptation arrived? This shift did not make him invincible. It made him survivable. Most people never make this shift. They wait until desire is present, then ask themselves to be wise. That is like asking a drowning man to remember swimming lessons. Odysseus tied the rope on dry land. The Siren's lesson is not about resisting pleasure. It is about respecting timing. There are truths you should hear only when you cannot act on them. There are desires you can safely feel only when they have no power. Wealth, like survival, depends less on what you know than on when you are allowed to decide. There is a final detail in this story that rarely survives retelling because it does not flatter the listener. After the Siren's song had fully faded and the ship returned to ordinary waters, Odysseus asked his men to describe what they had experienced. They told him there had been no struggle, no internal debate, no longing. With the wax in their ears, the island might as well not have existed. They rode, they breathed, they passed through. This disturbed him, not because he envied their peace, but because it revealed something merciless about human freedom. For the crew, ignorance was safety. For Odysseus, awareness required restraint. Knowledge did not liberate him, it endangered him. This inversion is the core tragedy of intelligence. The more you perceive, the more doors desire can open inside you. This is why wealth tends to destabilize people who acquire it suddenly. The problem is not the money, it is the expansion of choice without a corresponding expansion of structure. When options multiply, identity must harden or fracture. Many fracture quietly, persuading themselves they are still in control while drifting farther from shore. Odysseus understood that being exceptional did not exempt him from this law. In fact, it made him more vulnerable. The Sirens did not sing to every sailor equally. They tailored their song. To the proud, they sang legacy. To the weary, they sang rest. To the clever, they sang understanding. Temptation is personal. Systems must be impersonal to counter it. This is where the lesson becomes uncompromising. If your financial life depends on you being consistently wise, you are already exposed. Wisdom is not constant. Mood shifts, energy dips, circumstances intrude. The idea that one can remain vigilant forever is a comforting fantasy, not a strategy. The strongest financial architectures assume failure in advance. They ask where desire is likely to strike and remove leverage at that point. Income is diverted before it becomes identity. Investments are locked before impatience grows teeth. Spending requires friction, so that impulse meets resistance before action. This does not make life smaller, it makes it quieter. People often confuse restriction with punishment. Odysseus did not see the ropes as a sentence. He saw them as a passage. Once bound, he could hear without consequence. He could experience desire without obeying it. That is the subtle privilege structure offers. It allows awareness without sacrifice. Contrast this with the modern individual, endlessly exposed, endlessly deciding. Every purchase is a referendum on identity, every indulgence a moral negotiation. Over time, this constant decision-making exhausts the will. When exhaustion sets in, the Sirens do not need to sing loudly, a whisper will do. Odysseus's genius was recognizing that the most dangerous moments are not crises, but transitions, the space between intention and action. The seconds after desire appears, that is where lives tilt. So he intervened there, not with motivation, but with inevitability. This is why people who automate their financial priorities often describe an unexpected relief. Not because they are richer immediately, but because the inner debate has been silenced. There is nothing to argue about. The rope is already tied. The decision has already passed. Freedom, in this light, is not the ability to choose at any moment. It is the ability to live without constantly choosing. It is the absence of internal warfare. Odysseus did not return from the Sirens feeling victorious. He returned feeling aligned. The song never stopped existing. It never stops for us either. Desire is a permanent feature of being alive. The question is not how to eliminate it, but how to encounter it without surrendering direction. By the time Odysseus reached home, he had learned many lessons and forgotten some. But this one endured because it was written into his body. He had felt the rope. He had heard himself beg. He had survived the sound of his own weakness. That is the truth most people never hear. Not that they lack discipline, but that discipline alone is an unfair demand. The wiser path is not to become stronger, but to become earlier, to decide before the music starts, to build structures that do not care how convincing the song becomes. The Sirens are patient. They will wait for a night when you are tired, proud, lonely, or celebrating. They will sound like you, and if you have not already tied the rope, they will not need to push. Before the fall, there was silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles over a court where no one dares to disagree. Sardis shimmered in gold and marble, its markets heavy with foreign tribute, its vaults swollen with metal torn from the riverbeds of Lydia. Croesus ruled a kingdom so rich that wealth itself seemed to have chosen him as its guardian. Merchants traveled for weeks just to glimpse his city, then returned home exaggerating what they had seen because the truth sounded like myth. Croesus grew up surrounded by abundance, but abundance does not inoculate a man against fear, it sharpens it. The more he possessed, the more he felt the quiet pressure of losing it. Power attracts enemies the way light attracts insects. So when whispers of a rising Persian force reached his court, Croesus did what powerful men often do. He sought certainty. The oracle at Delphi had a reputation that crossed borders. Kings and generals consulted it, not because it spoke clearly, but because it spoke with authority. Its ambiguity felt sacred. Croesus sent lavish gifts ahead of his question, rivers of gold shaped into bowls and statues, offerings so extravagant that later historians suspected they were meant less to honor the gods than to intimidate them. When the oracle finally responded, its words were brief and elegant. If Croesus crossed the river and went to war, a great empire would fall. The court celebrated. The message sounded like destiny. Croesus heard what he needed to hear. He did not ask which empire. He did not ask for clarification. He did not press for warning. He asked for reassurance. And reassurance was what he received. There is a detail often overlooked in this exchange. Croesus did not consult the oracle once. He consulted multiple oracles across the Greek world, testing them with questions whose answers he already knew. When Delphi proved accurate, his confidence hardened into certainty. This was not wisdom, it was filtering. He was not seeking truth, he was seeking permission. When Croesus marched, his army glittered with armor polished more for spectacle than endurance. He crossed the river Halys with ceremony, believing the act itself sealed the prophecy. Battles followed, not decisive at first, but enough to convince him that momentum was on his side. When winter approached, he made a fatal assumption, that the enemy would retreat, that tradition would protect him. Cyrus did not retreat. The Persians pursued through the cold, crossed borders no one expected them to cross, and appeared at Sardis like a verdict arriving early. Croesus was unprepared. His walls were strong, but his confidence had eroded his caution. The city fell. The empire that collapsed was his own. Legend says Croesus was placed on a pyre, bound and ready to burn, when realization finally pierced him. The prophecy had been true. He had destroyed a great empire. He had simply misunderstood whose. In that moment, stripped of power and illusion, he laughed, not in madness, but in recognition. He had been warned. He had just chosen not to hear it. This is the danger of authority without constraint. Croesus did not lack intelligence. He lacked friction. Every voice around him echoed his confidence. The oracle's ambiguity allowed his desire to complete the sentence. He mistook agreement for guidance. Here is where the myth tightens into something uncomfortably modern. People rarely seek advice to be corrected. They seek it to be confirmed. They read articles, consult experts, watch analyses not to challenge their course, but to sanctify it. The mind, when invested, becomes a skilled lawyer. It builds a case. It ignores evidence that complicates the verdict. Croesus's tragedy was not arrogance alone. It was selective hearing. He surrounded himself with signals that reinforced his narrative and dismissed those that threatened it. The oracle did not lie. It allowed him to lie to himself. This is the spiritual law beneath the myth. Truth does not protect those who approach it with conditions. Insight bends toward the expectations of the listener. When desire is strong enough, even warnings become encouragement. In finance, this manifests long before money is lost. It begins with narratives, a market that must rebound, an asset that cannot fail, a strategy that worked before and therefore must work again. People do not ignore risk. They reinterpret it. They call it opportunity. They call it courage. They call it faith. Croesus crossed the river because crossing felt like action, and action feels like control. He did not build a system to contradict him. He did not empower anyone to stop him. He did not ask a question that could threaten his plan. He asked one that could only decorate it. The Sirens sang with beauty. The oracle spoke with restraint. Both were dangerous in the same way. They allowed the listener to finish the message himself. After Sardis fell, Croesus did not die as the stories promised he would. Cyrus spared him, not out of mercy, but curiosity. A man who had once been the richest ruler alive, now standing silent among the ashes of his certainty, was more valuable alive than dead. Croesus became an advisor, a relic of misjudgment preserved as instruction, and it is here, in his survival, that the deeper lesson emerges. Stripped of authority, Croesus began to speak differently. The confidence that once filled his voice thinned into caution. He warned Cyrus against pride, against assuming permanence, against mistaking momentum for destiny. Some accounts suggest Cyrus listened, others suggest he smiled politely and did what conquerors always do. History is unkind to those who believe they are exceptions. Croesus learned too late that the oracle had not been cruel. It had been precise. The cruelty came from interpretation. He wanted certainty in a world governed by probability. He wanted prophecy to function like a contract, binding the future to his intention. But prophecy, like markets, does not serve desire. It reveals structure. The Greeks understood this ambiguity as sacred. Truth was not a straight line. It was something approached sideways, indirectly, because the human mind could not tolerate it head-on without distortion. The oracle spoke in riddles not to confuse, but to protect. Protection failed when the listener demanded reassurance instead of understanding. This is the spiritual law beneath Croesus's fall. When a person seeks guidance while already committed to an outcome, insight becomes cosmetic. It decorates decisions rather than shaping them. Wisdom is reduced to ornament. In modern life, this is how people consume financial knowledge. They scroll, read, watch, and listen, not to discover what to do, but to feel justified in what they already plan to do. They gravitate toward voices that sound confident, certain, aligned with their appetite. Dissenting opinions feel uncomfortable, even hostile, so they are filtered out. Croesus tested the oracles, not to learn, but to verify. Once one spoke accurately, he elevated it to authority. Authority then replaced responsibility. If the oracle approved, the outcome was no longer his burden. This is a subtle abdication of agency. When decisions are outsourced to validation, accountability dissolves. The philosophy here is unforgiving. Desire reshapes perception. The mind becomes an accomplice. What feels like intuition is often appetite wearing ceremonial robes. This is why intelligent people fall harder than the naive. Their narratives are better constructed, their justifications more elegant. In finance, this manifests as confirmation bias. Investors seek data that supports their position and dismiss data that threatens it. They call this conviction. They call it patience. In reality, it is attachment. Croesus was attached to expansion. Every sign was interpreted through that lens. Even ambiguity bent in his favor. The antidote is not more information. Croesus had access to the most revered sources of his time. The antidote is adversarial structure, a system that does not care what you want, a rule that contradicts you when you are most convinced. Modern investors who survive long arcs understand this instinctively. They build exit rules before entry. They define risk thresholds before emotion arrives. They pre-commit to loss limits, diversification, and rebalancing schedules that override narrative momentum. These are not strategies of fear, they are strategies of humility. Croesus could have asked a different question. He could have asked what would be lost. He could have asked how not to lose everything. He could have asked for warning instead of validation. But that question threatened his identity as a destined ruler, so he avoided it. This avoidance is common. People do not ask how to preserve wealth. They ask how to grow it faster. Preservation sounds timid. Growth sounds heroic. Croesus wanted to be heroic. The oracle let him be. There is an uncomfortable truth here. Markets, like oracles, are not malicious. They reflect, they echo, they respond to behavior, not intention. If you approach them seeking confirmation, they will eventually give you a lesson instead. Croesus's laughter on the pyre was not madness, it was recognition. He finally heard what had always been said, too late to change the outcome, but early enough to understand the pattern. Understanding does not always save us, sometimes it arrives only to name the mistake. The real danger is not loss, it is certainty without constraint. In the years that followed, Croesus became something rare in history, a living warning. He moved through the Persian court not as a ruler, but as a reminder of what happens when certainty goes unchallenged. Some chroniclers claim that Cyrus kept him close during campaigns, not for counsel alone, but as a kind of talisman against hubris. A man who had touched the peak and fallen intact carried a gravity no prophecy could replicate. There is a quiet irony here. Croesus, once deafened by abundance, could finally hear clearly only after losing everything. Without power to protect, without wealth to justify, his perception sharpened. He saw patterns instead of promises, probabilities instead of destiny. What he learned too late is what the myth leaves for us. The spiritual law beneath his fall is this: desire does not silence warnings, it reframes them. When the outcome matters too much, the mind stops asking honest questions. It asks decorative ones. Questions whose answers feel useful, comforting, energizing. This is not self-deception in the crude sense. It is self-editing, truth trimmed to fit intention. The oracle never said Croesus would win. It said an empire would fall. Ambiguity was not the flaw, it was the mirror. Croesus looked into it and saw what he wanted to see. In that sense, the oracle functioned perfectly. It revealed the listener's inner alignment. This is why ancient wisdom distrusted certainty. The Greeks believed that absolute clarity belonged to the gods, not to men. Mortals were expected to navigate probability with humility, to move cautiously when information was incomplete. Croesus rejected this posture. He wanted divine endorsement, not human doubt. Modern finance punishes the same mistake. Markets are not oracles, but they behave like them. They offer signals, not guarantees, trends, not destinies. When people approach them seeking certainty, they hear what reinforces their appetite. Bullish news is magnified. Bearish signals are dismissed as noise. Risk warnings are reframed as opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. This is how bubbles form, not from ignorance, but from selective attention. Smart people, surrounded by confirming voices, slowly lose the ability to hear contradiction. The room grows quieter, not because there is no dissent, but because dissent has been filtered out. Croesus's court functioned the same way. Advisors learned which truths were welcome. Silence became a survival skill. Over time, the king mistook the absence of opposition for correctness. This is why unchecked power corrodes judgment. It removes friction. Without friction, movement feels effortless, even when it is heading downhill. In personal finance, friction is often framed as inefficiency. Penalties, delays, restrictions are seen as obstacles to be optimized away, but friction exists for a reason. It slows action until reflection can arrive. It creates space between impulse and execution. The practical lesson here is precise and unsentimental. If your financial decisions depend on you noticing risk in the moment, you are already too late. By the time risk feels real, emotion has already entered the room. Croesus felt invincible crossing the river. He felt foolish only when the city burned. Wise investors build systems that argue with them, rules that sell when they want to hold, allocations that rebalance when attachment grows, diversification that dilutes conviction. These mechanisms feel conservative in calm times and life-saving in turbulent ones. This is not about pessimism, it is about asymmetry. Losses compound faster than gains. Pride accelerates exposure. Humility preserves optionality. Croesus lost his empire because he treated uncertainty as endorsement. The modern equivalent is overconcentration, leverage justified by narrative, risk tolerated because previous success feels like proof. There is another uncomfortable parallel. Croesus believed the oracle because it had been right before. Past accuracy created trust. This is how people become loyal to strategies, advisors, and even their own instincts long after conditions change. What once worked becomes sacred. Questioning it feels like betrayal, but markets evolve. Context shifts. The prophecy that was true yesterday can be lethal tomorrow. Croesus's greatest error was not crossing the river. It was crossing it without an exit plan. He committed everything to one interpretation, one reading, one future. When it failed, there was no retreat, no containment, no partial loss, only collapse. This is why the most durable financial strategies emphasize survivability over brilliance. They assume misinterpretation is inevitable. They limit damage when it occurs. They do not rely on being right, they rely on not being ruined. Croesus survived physically, but his identity did not. He lived long enough to understand that wealth without constraint invites delusion, and authority without opposition invites disaster. That understanding, stripped of power, became wisdom. The oracle did not deceive him. He deceived himself, politely, intelligently, and with great confidence. Before there was labor, before there was scarcity, before there was the concept of earning at all, there was a garden where nothing had to be decided. That is the detail most people miss. Eden was not paradise because it was beautiful. It was paradise because it was simple. The land fed its inhabitants without negotiation. The trees gave fruit without price. There were no ledgers, no trade, no accumulation. And yet, at the very center of this abundance, there stood a boundary, one tree, one prohibition. Not because everything else was insufficient, but because everything else was already enough. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. The first temptation did not arrive as hunger. It arrived as curiosity. The serpent did not promise survival. Survival was already guaranteed. It promised expansion, knowledge, perspective, the ability to see more than was currently permitted. You will not die, it whispered. You will simply know. That is always how excess enters the human story. Not as need, but as optional improvement. Adam and Eve were not starving, they were not oppressed, they were not desperate, they were bored, or perhaps more precisely, they were aware that a choice existed that had not yet been exercised. The forbidden tree did not dominate the garden physically, it dominated it psychologically. It introduced comparison into a world without lack. The moment they ate, nothing exploded. The sky did not tear open, the earth did not collapse. What changed was subtler and more devastating. Awareness fractured innocence. They noticed themselves. They noticed each other. They noticed vulnerability. And for the first time, abundance felt fragile. This is the spiritual law embedded in the myth. Unlimited access does not produce freedom. It produces anxiety. Once every option is available, responsibility becomes unbearable. Choice multiplies consequence. The human mind, once exposed to alternatives, cannot return to rest. Eden did not fall because of evil. It fell because of unguarded possibility. Ancient theologians argued for centuries about whether the prohibition was cruel or necessary, but from a structural perspective, the answer is clear. The boundary was the garden's stabilizer. It concentrated desire into a single channel, making everything else invisible by contrast. Remove the boundary, and desire spreads everywhere. This pattern repeats relentlessly in financial life. When money first becomes abundant, it does not immediately corrupt. It expands choice, and choice feels empowering. You can buy this, you can afford that, you can upgrade, enhance, accelerate. At first, these options feel like freedom. Over time, they become obligation. Maintaining a larger lifestyle requires more attention, more income, more risk. What began as optional becomes necessary. The serpent never says you must, it says you can. This is why people who experience sudden wealth often report unexpected stress. Not because money is evil, but because it dissolves constraint faster than identity can adapt. When everything is possible, nothing feels secure. Eden after the fruit was not hostile, it was exposed. The philosophy here is precise. Constraint is not the enemy of growth. It is the container that makes growth sustainable. The garden functioned because most choices had already been made. Food was provided. Shelter existed. Life had rhythm. The single prohibition did not reduce freedom. It preserved coherence. In modern terms, this is why people who automate financial decisions often feel calmer than those who optimize endlessly. Endless optimization is the serpent's domain. There is always a better option, a higher yield, a smarter allocation. Without boundaries, the mind never rests. Every decision reopens the entire system. The financial application is not about austerity, it is about designed limitation, allocations that cap lifestyle inflation, rules that restrict access to surplus. Systems that define enough before desire defines more. When you decide in advance what you will not touch, the rest of your resources regain clarity. Adam and Eve did not fail because they wanted knowledge. They failed because they encountered it without preparation. The tree was not poison, it was premature. Timing matters. Exposure without structure destabilizes even perfect environments. This is why friction is essential in financial systems. Delays, penalties, locked accounts. These are not punishments. They are modern versions of the forbidden tree. They signal where not to linger. They narrow the field of action so that life can be lived without constant negotiation. Once Eden was lost, work entered the world. Labor, sweat, calculation. Not as punishment alone, but as compensation. Structure had to be rebuilt through effort because it was no longer embedded in the environment. The same happens in personal finance. When boundaries are absent, discipline must work over time. And discipline, like labor, is exhausting. The lesson of the garden is not moralistic, it is architectural. Design the environment so that most decisions do not exist. Decide once, early, calmly, then live inside that decision without revisiting it daily. The serpent still speaks. It speaks through upgrades, leverage, optional indulgences dressed as rewards. It does not ask you to destroy your future, it asks you to expand your present just a little. Eden is always lost gradually. After the exile, the garden did not vanish. It remained behind them, guarded, unreachable, unchanged. This detail matters. Eden was not destroyed as punishment, it was sealed. Humanity did not lose abundance itself, but access without cost. From that moment forward, every form of sustenance would require effort, planning, and restraint. The world shifted from gift to negotiation. Adam learned to till soil that resisted him. Eve learned cycles of pain and care that demanded foresight. Time entered the human experience not as a backdrop, but as a constraint. Seasons mattered, delays mattered, consequences stretched forward instead of arriving instantly. This was not cruelty, it was recalibration. The loss of the garden forced structure back into existence. Before the fall, choice had been minimal. After the fall, choice multiplied violently. What to plant, when to harvest, how much to store, which risks to take. Survival now depended on sequencing decisions correctly across time. The forbidden tree had taught humanity something irreversible. Once you know more options exist, you cannot unknow them, you must manage them. This is the deeper philosophical layer beneath the myth. Innocence is not ignorance, it is bounded awareness. The human nervous system functions best when the number of active choices is limited. When possibilities exceed processing capacity, anxiety fills the gap. The mind begins scanning for threats, for missed opportunities, for regret. This is why abundance without boundaries destabilizes identity. In financial life, this phenomenon appears whenever income rises faster than structure. At first, more money feels like relief. Bills disappear, pressure eases, but soon, the mind begins to notice new doors, new lifestyles, new comparisons. What was once contentment becomes optimization. What was once enough becomes baseline. The danger is subtle. There is no dramatic collapse. There is only a creeping sense that whatever you have is temporary and therefore must be enjoyed now. This is how surplus quietly erodes future security, not through extravagance, but through expanded expectations. Eden failed not because there was too little discipline, but because discipline was no longer necessary until suddenly it was. The boundary existed, but it was external. Once crossed, humanity had to internalize restraint. That is a much heavier burden. This mirrors what happens when people remove all financial constraints in the name of freedom. No budgets, no caps, no rules. Everything decided in the moment. At first, this feels adult, empowered, liberated. Over time, it becomes exhausting. Every purchase becomes a micro-debate. Every indulgence carries a shadow of guilt. Every future plan feels fragile. Structure reduces cognitive load. This is its hidden gift. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. Many imposed sumptuary laws, not to punish wealth, but to limit its expression. Clothing, feasts, even home size were regulated. These rules were not about equality, they were about social stability. When displays of excess grew unchecked, envy, anxiety, and reckless imitation followed. The serpent's promise was not false. Knowledge does expand perspective, but expansion without containment fractures coherence. That is the law Eden illustrates. Growth must be staged. Choice must be introduced gradually, or it overwhelms the system. In finance, this translates into staged access. Not all money should be equally reachable. Not all accounts should be visible daily. Not all assets should be liquid. This is not fear-based thinking. It is cognitive hygiene. When everything is accessible, everything competes for attention. People often resist this idea because it feels infantilizing. Why shouldn't I trust myself? But Eden answers this question without apology. Trust is not enough. Even in a perfect environment, unbounded choice destabilizes. The issue is not morality, it is architecture. Consider how retirement systems are designed. Contributions are deducted before income is felt. Access is delayed. Penalties exist. These features are often criticized as restrictive. In reality, they recreate a fragment of Eden's boundary. They protect the future from the present's curiosity. The modern consumer economy does the opposite. It removes friction relentlessly. One-click purchases. Instant credit. Buy now, decide later. The serpent has learned new languages, but the message is unchanged. You can have this. You can expand now. Consequences are distant. Adam and Eve did not collapse immediately after eating the fruit. They lived, they worked, they adapted. The punishment was not sudden death, it was chronic complexity. Life became a sequence of trade-offs instead of a given rhythm. That is what unstructured abundance creates, a life of endless trade-offs. The financial application here is not asceticism, it is selective blindness. You do not need to see every option. You do not need to know every opportunity. You need a bounded field where most decisions are already resolved. Define ceilings before growth tests them. Define what is untouchable before temptation asks. Define enough while contentment is still possible. The garden fell because the boundary was crossed. The lesson survives because boundaries can be rebuilt, not everywhere, but where it matters most. Long before empires collapsed under excess and markets learned to disguise hunger as opportunity, a young man stood at the edge of the Nile Valley and chose disappearance. His name was Anthony, the son of prosperous landowners, raised among vineyards and fertile soil. He was not born into deprivation. He inherited comfort, and it was precisely this comfort that began to disturb him. The story begins not with a vision, but with a sentence overheard. Anthony entered a church one morning and heard a passage read aloud, words that struck him with the quiet violence of inevitability. Sell what you have, give to the poor, follow. Nothing dramatic happened in the room, no thunder, no voice from the sky, but something in Anthony shifted. He felt exposed, as if the sentence had been waiting for him specifically. Within months, he had given away his inheritance, not gradually, not symbolically. He transferred land, wealth, and responsibility to others, then walked east into the desert. People assumed grief or madness. Some whispered that guilt had driven him. Others believed he sought fame through sacrifice. But those who later visited him would tell a different story. Anthony did not flee the world because he hated it. He left because it spoke too loudly. The desert was not empty, it was brutal. Heat pressed down without mercy. Nights froze bone. Hunger arrived without apology, and then came the temptations. Not sensual at first, but psychological. Regret, doubt, the memory of comfort returning like a ghost. Anthony would later describe these as the most dangerous assaults because they felt reasonable. Why suffer when resources exist? Why choose scarcity when abundance is possible? Here is the crucial insight. Anthony did not battle temptation through argument. He changed location. He understood that certain environments generate certain behaviors regardless of intention. The city produced distraction. The desert produced silence. In silence, impulses could be observed without being obeyed. This was not asceticism for its own sake. It was an experiment in environmental control. As years passed, Anthony became known not for suffering, but for clarity. Visitors came seeking wisdom, expecting sermons. Instead, they found a man who spoke sparingly, who advised less, who mostly asked where people lived and how they spent their days. He knew that answers revealed less than surroundings. The spiritual law beneath his life is simple and severe. You do not rise to the level of your ideals. You sink to the level of your environment. Willpower is temporary. Context is permanent. Anthony removed himself from stimuli not to become holy, but to become stable. Without constant interruption, desire weakened. Without comparison, envy dissolved. Without abundance at arm's reach, choice narrowed. Narrowing brought peace. This is the part modern listeners resist. We prefer to believe we can remain in high-stimulation environments and simply choose better. Anthony's life argues the opposite. He believed that proximity creates pressure. What is near demands attention. What is distant loses its voice. In financial terms, this is devastatingly relevant. Most spending does not come from need. It comes from exposure, seeing what others have, being reminded of what is available, feeling surrounded by signals that whisper improvement. Anthony walked away from the city because it constantly reminded him of options he did not need. Modern consumers live inside a permanent city. Notifications, images, comparisons arrive uninvited. In such an environment, restraint feels heroic because it is unnatural. Anthony did not train himself to resist endlessly. He reduced the number of times resistance was required. This is environmental minimalism, not moral minimalism. The financial application is precise. If you want wealth to grow quietly, remove it from noisy environments. Do not place long-term capital in spaces designed for short-term stimulation. Accounts that update constantly provoke interference. Markets watched obsessively invite action. Easy access invites negotiation. Anthony's desert was illiquid. Nothing there could be exchanged quickly. This was not a flaw, it was the feature. Illiquidity protects intention from impatience. Consider how many people sabotage investments, not because they are wrong, but because they are visible. Watching daily fluctuations feels informative, but it invites emotional response. Anthony did not stare at passing caravans and imagine alternatives. He removed himself from the road. The desert stripped life down to essentials: water, food, shelter, time. When variables are reduced, outcomes stabilize. Wealth behaves the same way. Complexity increases risk. Simplicity compounds. Anthony eventually attracted followers. The desert filled with others seeking quiet. Structures formed. Monastic life emerged not from theology alone, but from practicality, rules, rhythms, shared restraint. These were not punishments. They were buffers against human volatility. The world never stopped calling, but its voice faded with distance. Anthony did not conquer temptation. He relocated beyond its range. That is the lesson the desert offers. If you cannot silence the song, move far enough away that it loses power. The Roman soldier did not wait for virtue to arrive. He was not asked to be wise with his wages. He was not trusted to remember the future while standing in the heat of the present. Rome understood something fundamental about human nature long before economists gave it language. When men are paid in full, they behave as if tomorrow is optional, so Rome intervened. A legionary's pay did not pass freely through his hands. A portion was withheld, not as punishment, but as design. Grain rations, equipment costs, and savings for discharge were deducted before temptation could speak. The soldier received what remained and learned to live within it. Years later, when service ended, a sum awaited him: land, coin, security, not because he had been disciplined every day, but because the system had been disciplined on his behalf. This was not generosity, it was strategy. Rome did not build its empire by trusting individual restraint. It built it by embedding restraint into institutions. The legions marched not only with swords and shields, but with financial architecture. A soldier distracted by hunger or debt is unreliable. A soldier who knows his future, is provisioned, fights differently. Calm replaces panic. Patience replaces desperation. The brilliance of this system lay in its invisibility. The deduction was not framed as loss. It was normal, expected. The soldier did not experience the pain of choosing to save. The choice had already been made by the empire. And so resentment rarely arose. People resist restrictions they perceive as imposed on them. They accept restrictions that feel like reality. Rome turned pre-commitment into culture. This approach extended beyond the army. Roman households practiced similar logic. Wealth was stored in forms that resisted impulse. Land, livestock, infrastructure. Coin was useful, but it was not the primary vessel of security. Liquidity was convenient. Stability was prized. The philosophy beneath this is unsentimental. Humans are unreliable custodians of surplus in moments of comfort. Excess invites softness. Softness erodes readiness. Rome had no interest in moralizing this tendency. It simply worked around it. Here is the deeper pattern. When survival depends on consistency, systems must override mood. The empire did not ask soldiers to imagine their retirement while surrounded by taverns and markets. It ensured that future resources were accumulating regardless of what the present demanded. This is the spiritual law of institutional wisdom. Do not argue with human nature. Design around it. Modern societies quietly copied this model. Payroll taxes, pension contributions, social insurance. These are often criticized as paternalistic, but they exist because centuries of evidence prove that optional saving fails at scale. When saving competes with desire, desire wins often enough to destabilize the whole. Rome did not leave this to chance. There is a revealing detail in military records. Soldiers sometimes complained about deductions, but rarely attempted to circumvent them. Why? Because the rule was universal, no one was exempt. Exemption breeds resentment, universality breeds acceptance. This matters in personal finance more than people realize. The most effective savings systems are not those that feel heroic, but those that feel boring, automatic transfers that occur on the same day, in the same amount without fanfare. When a rule applies to you consistently, it becomes part of the landscape rather than an obstacle. Contrast this with the modern individual who tries to save manually. Each month becomes a negotiation. How much this time? What about this expense? Maybe next month more. The mind tires of these debates. Rome eliminated debate entirely. The financial application here is not about patriotism or obedience. It is about sequencing. Money should be divided before identity attaches to it. Once income feels like yours in full, any reduction feels like loss. But when division happens upstream, the remainder feels complete. This is why automated savings feel painless compared to manual ones. The pain of separation is never experienced. There is no moment of sacrifice. Only a stable pattern that quietly accumulates force. Rome's legions did not depend on exceptional men. They depended on ordinary men placed inside extraordinary systems. That is the lesson that endures. You do not need to become stoic every day. You need a structure that assumes you will not be. Empires rise when institutions outlast individuals. Wealth accumulates the same way. Rome paid its soldiers before they could spend. In doing so, it bought loyalty, endurance, and time. In the narrow streets of medieval Paris, where stone walls trapped the smell of smoke and damp parchment, a man lived whose name would later be spoken in whispers. Nicolas Flamel was not born mysterious. He was a scribe, a bookseller, a man of ink-stained fingers and patient habits. He copied texts for a living, married late, and lived quietly. Nothing about his early life suggested legend, and yet legend found him anyway. The story begins, as many dangerous stories do, with a book. Flamel claimed that one night he dreamed of an angel handing him a strange volume. Its cover was copper, its pages filled with symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when he looked away. Years later, a book eerily similar appeared in his shop, sold cheaply by a traveler who did not understand its value. Flamel bought it, not knowing why, only that it felt inevitable. The text would consume decades of his life. The book was said to contain the secret of the philosopher's stone. Not merely a way to make gold, but a process of transformation. Matter refined through stages, impurity burned away, essence revealed. Most seekers who chased such knowledge did so for wealth or immortality. Flamel approached it differently. He studied obsessively, but slowly. He traveled. He consulted scholars. He prayed. He waited. Years passed without result. Poverty brushed close. His wife Pernelle supported him with quiet faith. Then, according to legend, something changed. Flamel succeeded. Base metals turned radiant. Illness receded. Time softened its grip. And here is where the story diverges from expectation. Flamel did not live like a king. Instead of display, he funded hospitals. Instead of indulgence, he built shelters. Instead of power, he chose obscurity. He continued to live modestly, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary man. Rumors spread precisely because evidence was absent. No vaults, no armies, no monuments, only quiet generosity and an unusual longevity. Why refuse the obvious reward? This question haunted those who heard the tale. If gold could be made endlessly, why not enjoy it? Why not rule? Why not dominate a world so easily bent by wealth? Flamel's refusal felt almost offensive to ambition, but within it lies the core lesson. The philosopher's stone was never meant to produce gold. It was meant to produce restraint. Alchemy was not chemistry, it was spiritual sequencing. The transformation of matter mirrored the transformation of the self. Impatience ruined the work. Greed poisoned the process. Only those who could delay gratification long enough were worthy of the outcome. In this sense, the stone was a test more than a tool. Flamel understood that premature use would undo the work entirely. This is the philosophy beneath his restraint. Power obtained before identity is ready destabilizes. Gold amplifies intention. If intention is unrefined, the result is corruption, not freedom. Flamel did not fear wealth. He feared becoming smaller in its presence. This is the alchemical law of delay. Transformation must complete before extraction. Skip stages, and the substance collapses. In human terms, this means that enjoying rewards too early sabotages the very growth that made them possible. Modern finance rarely teaches this. People are encouraged to harvest quickly, take profits, upgrade lifestyle, celebrate wins immediately, but compounding is a fragile process. It depends on time, consistency, and non-interference. The moment you extract too much too soon, the curve flattens. Growth turns linear, then stagnates. Flamel's gold remained powerful because it remained untouched. This is the financial application hidden in the myth. Wealth that compounds requires protection from the owner, not because the owner is malicious, but because the owner is human. The urge to enjoy is natural. The discipline to wait is rare. Long-term capital works best when it is treated as sacred, not visible. Not discussed, not adjusted in response to mood. This is why the most successful endowments and family fortunes are managed with almost religious restraint. Rules govern withdrawals. Time horizons stretch beyond individual lifespans. Personal desire is subordinate to continuity. Flamel lived as if he understood this instinctively. There is a persistent rumor that he and his wife faked their deaths, disappearing to live elsewhere. Whether true or not, the rumor itself reveals the power of his example. A man who could have everything chose invisibility. A man who could consume chose to preserve. In a world intoxicated by immediacy, this feels alien. The alchemist's lesson is not to reject pleasure forever. It is to respect sequence, growth first, extraction later, identity before indulgence. When this order is reversed, wealth becomes corrosive. Flamel's restraint was not moral theater, it was structural wisdom. He understood that the hardest part of wealth is not creating it, but surviving it without distortion. When Hernán Cortés set foot on the shores of the New World, he carried more than soldiers and steel. He carried a dangerous ambiguity. The men who followed him were not conquerors by destiny. They were men with options. Ships waited behind them. Spain existed behind the horizon. Retreat was possible, and because it was possible, it lived in their minds. Cortés understood something essential about commitment. As long as an escape exists, it competes with focus. Fear does not disappear in the presence of opportunity, it multiplies. Every hardship becomes negotiable. Every setback whispers of return. The human spirit fractures when it must fight and keep an exit open at the same time. So Cortés made a decision that would define his legend. He ordered the ships destroyed, not hidden, not guarded, not sailed away. Destroyed, wood splintered, hulls burned. Iron sank, the sea swallowed the past. The men watched their last physical connection to safety dissolve into smoke and salt. Some protested, some raged, some felt a hollow terror open in their chests. Cortés did not argue, he did not justify, he acted. In that moment, something irreversible occurred. Fear lost one of its greatest weapons. There was nowhere else to go. The campaign that followed was brutal, chaotic, uncertain, but something had changed. The men no longer debated whether to continue. They debated how. Energy that would have been spent imagining retreat was redirected toward adaptation. Improvisation sharpened. Alliances formed. Risks were taken not recklessly, but necessarily. The philosophy beneath this act is severe and ancient. Optionality weakens resolve once a path is chosen. Too many exits fracture commitment. When the mind can escape, it does not fully inhabit the present struggle. Cortés did not burn the boats because he was fearless. He burned them because he knew fear needed fewer tools. This is the spiritual law of irreversibility. Certain commitments must be made final to unlock full alignment. Half commitment preserves comfort, but sabotages transformation. The self does not reorganize until it believes there is no return to the previous state. In modern life, this principle is avoided because it feels extreme. People prefer flexibility. They want backup plans, safety nets, reversible decisions. But wealth, like conquest, often requires periods of illiquidity, capital locked away, choices narrowed, paths closed deliberately. The financial application is precise. Some investments only work when withdrawal is difficult. Some strategies only mature when interference is impossible. This is why long-term wealth is often stored in forms that resist access. Real assets, restricted funds, structures with penalties for early exit. Burning the boats in finance does not mean recklessness. It means clarity. Once a long-term plan is chosen, constant reconsideration becomes a liability. The urge to optimize, to adjust, to respond to noise erodes focus. Cortez' men did not win because they were stronger. They won because hesitation was removed. This does not apply to every decision. Irreversibility is powerful and dangerous. It must be used selectively, but when applied at the right moment, it collapses inner conflict. Energy consolidates. The mind stops scanning for alternatives and begins solving problems. Cortez understood that identity follows action. Once retreat was impossible, the men became conquerors, not by declaration, but by necessity. The same transformation occurs in financial life when capital is committed beyond easy reach. The owner stops fantasizing about spending and starts thinking about stewardship. Burning the boats is not about bravery, it is about timing. You do it after preparation, not before. Cortez did not destroy the ships upon arrival. He waited until alliances were possible, until supplies were secured, until retreat had become more dangerous than commitment. The mistake many people make is either never burning the boats or burning them too early. Both lead to ruin. Wisdom lies in knowing when optionality has outlived its usefulness. The Sirens sang to Odysseus. Croesus trusted the oracle. Adam and Eve reached for knowledge. Anthony fled the city. Rome withheld pay. Flamel refused gold. Cortez destroyed retreat. All of them understood, in different ways, that freedom must be shaped, not indulged. That choice must sometimes be removed to preserve direction. That wealth and survival depend not on constant strength, but on decisive structure. The boats burned. The smoke cleared. There was no going back. When the ship is far enough from the island, the sea changes texture. It is not something you notice immediately. There is no line drawn on the water, no signal that danger has passed, only a subtle absence, a quiet where something once pressed against the mind and no longer does. Odysseus did not speak when the Sirens fell silent. He lay against the mast, wrists marked, muscles trembling, breath uneven. The ropes were loosened slowly, almost reverently. His crew returned to their places, oars dipping again into familiar rhythm. The world resumed, and yet, something irreversible had occurred. The song had failed. This is important. The Sirens were not defeated. They were not destroyed. They did not vanish in anger or despair. They simply lost jurisdiction. Their voices still existed, echoing across the rocks, waiting for the next ship that believed strength alone would be enough. But for Odysseus, the song no longer had authority. This is the true end of temptation. Not resistance, not conquest, but irrelevance. Most people imagine mastery as silence. They believe that one day the urge will disappear, that desire will finally stop knocking. But ancient wisdom never promised this. Desire is older than morality. It is woven into breath, hunger, curiosity, and fear. The Sirens sing because they must. The question has never been whether the song will play, but whether it will be allowed to steer. Odysseus learned something that day that followed him long after Ithaca came back into view. He learned that freedom is not found in limitless choice, but in limited exposure. That peace is not the absence of desire, but the absence of negotiation. Once the decision is removed from the moment of temptation, the mind can rest. This is where wealth quietly enters the story one final time. People often believe that financial peace comes from having more income, more buffers, more flexibility. But flexibility without structure produces anxiety, not calm. When every option remains open, the mind remains alert, scanning, comparing, calculating. Rest becomes conditional. The people who appear calm around money are rarely those with the most access. They are those with the fewest decisions left to make. Their savings move automatically. Their investments follow rules they no longer revisit emotionally. Their lifestyles are defined by ceilings rather than appetites. They do not wake each morning asking what they should do with their resources. That question has already been answered. This is not laziness, it is foresight. The sirens of modern life are everywhere. They sing through polished glass and glowing screens. They whisper that comfort is deserved now. That delay is unnecessary. That opportunity will vanish if not seized immediately. They speak in your own voice, using your own reasoning, borrowing your own values, and like the ancient sirens, they are most dangerous when you are tired, successful, lonely, or celebrating. The lesson that binds every story you have heard is not moral, it is structural. Odysseus tied himself. Croesus failed to bind his certainty. The garden collapsed when the boundary was crossed. Antony fled the environment. Rome automated restraint. Flamel delayed extraction. Cortez removed retreat. Each story reveals the same truth from a different angle. Humans do not fail because they are weak. They fail because they rely on strength where design is required. Wealth, like survival, favors those who decide early and execute blindly. Not blindly in ignorance, but blindly in trust. Trust in the version of yourself that chose when nothing was singing. Trust in the system that does not argue back. Trust in the rope. By the time the song arrives, it is already too late to negotiate. The only question is whether you prepared for that moment while the sea was still calm. If you listen carefully now, you may still hear it. A distant echo, not commanding, not threatening, just inviting. It will always be there. The world depends on it, but you no longer need to answer. The mast stands firm, the rope holds, and the ship keeps moving forward. Settle your breath, not by forcing it, but by noticing it. The rise, the fall, like the tide against a quiet shore. Nothing urgent, nothing demanded, just the rhythm that has always carried you long before you learned to worry about the future. Imagine the sea at night, not storming, not restless, dark, wide, patient. The ship moves forward without effort, guided by a current you do not need to see to trust. The mast stands at the center, solid, unmoving. Around it, a rope. Thick, rough, certain. This rope is not restraint, it is relief. You do not need to hold yourself together anymore. You do not need to remember rules or summon discipline. The decision has already been made, long ago, in a calmer moment. When your mind was clear and your vision long, that decision is now doing the work for you. The sirens may still sing, let them. Their voices drift across the water, distant and indistinct. They no longer speak to you, not because you are stronger, but because they cannot reach the helm. The rope has removed their access. Feel how quiet that is. Your body understands structure. Bones know where to rest because they are held. Muscles soften when they are supported. The mind does the same when choice is removed. When the future is protected from the present, thought slows, breath deepens. The nervous system stands down. You are safe because nothing is required of you. Money no longer needs your attention tonight. It is moving where it needs to go, automatically, silently, without debate. A portion flows away before you ever see it, like water diverted upstream, nourishing something far ahead in time. You do not chase it. You do not check it. You trust the channel. Repeat this quietly inside yourself. I decided early. I do not decide again. Feel how that sentence settles. No tension, no effort, just fact. You are not resisting desire. You are resting beyond its reach. Desire belongs to the waking world, to daylight and noise and motion. Here, it loses its grip. Here, the future is already funded. The present is already sufficient. Each breath loosens the need to intervene. Your savings grow while you sleep. Your plans advance without your supervision. Your wealth is patient because you are patient. There is nothing heroic happening. No struggle, no victory, only alignment. The kind that feels almost boring in its reliability. That boredom is peace. The ship continues. The water parts. Time stretches forward like an open path that does not require your vigilance. You are allowed to be unconscious of it for a while. That is the gift of systems. They work when you do not. If a thought arises, let it pass like a wave, hitting the hull and sliding away. You do not need to follow it. The rope will hold. It always does. You trusted yourself once. That was enough. Now rest inside that trust. Let the world become softer at the edges now, not fading, just loosening its grip. The night does not ask you to solve anything. It does not ask you to plan. It only asks you to drift, the way the ship drifts when the current already knows the direction. Notice how effort leaves the body first. The jaw unclenches. The shoulders lower, the hands release whatever they have been holding all day, ideas, expectations, small worries disguised as responsibilities. You do not drop them, you simply stop carrying them. The rope remains. You do not need to check it. You do not need to test it. It was tied with intention, with calm hands, with a mind that was not hurried. That version of you is still here, still competent, still guiding the path forward, even while you rest. Hear the water against the hull, slow, repeating, honest, the kind of sound that does not persuade, does not flatter, does not ask. It simply is. Let your breathing fall into that rhythm. In, out. Like oars dipping without effort, the siren's song may wander nearby, but it sounds different now. thinner, less convincing. It does not speak to your needs because your needs are already met. It does not speak to your future because your future is already protected. Repeat this quietly as if you are reminding the body, not the mind. My future is guarded. My present is enough. Feel how these words do not demand belief. They describe a structure that exists whether you think about it or not. Savings moving before desire appears, investments compounding without commentary, boundaries holding even when attention drifts. You are not missing anything. Sleep deepens when the mind realizes it is not on duty. There are no alerts to watch for, no choices waiting at the door. The ship does not ask permission to keep moving. It moves because movement was decided earlier. This is how wealth grows best, quietly, without applause, without constant supervision, while the owner sleeps. Let that idea settle into the body. Money does not require my vigilance. Time is working on my behalf. The night stretches wide. Hours open like a long dark river carrying the ship forward. You are not steering. You are not navigating. You are being carried by decisions already made, already implemented, already underway. If an image appears, let it soften. If a thought returns, let it dissolve. You do not need to push anything away. The rope makes effort unnecessary. The mast stands. The rope holds. The sea remains calm. Each repetition is not an instruction, but a reassurance. A signal to the deeper parts of you that structure is present, that safety is real, that nothing will be demanded while you rest. Stay here for a while. Let the night do its work.